hopefully tonight we will know more about why we as individuals and we as societies and we as groups make some of the decisions and choices that we do. And to help us understand that, we are honored and thrilled to have with us tonight Daniel McFadden, professor of economics at both USC and UC Berkeley, the 2000 Nobel Laureate in Economic Studies, a recognition for his development of theories and methods for analyzing discrete choice. We are equally honored and thrilled to have with us Jerry Diamond, professor of geography at UCLA and a National Geographic Explorer in residence, author of numerous books, including Guns, Germs, and Steel, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize, and also the book Collapse, about how societies choose to fail or succeed. Well, we think we always know why we make choices because we make them in our best self-interest. We are told by political leaders the people know best what is good for them. They know best how to spend their money, what they want, what to do with their lives. And yet we know as individuals we do make some wrong choices. We have marriages that don't work out, investments that don't work out, jobs that we wish we hadn't taken, cars we wish we hadn't bought, shirts we wish we hadn't picked out of the closet. So as we look at the bigger picture, if we make all these bad choices individuals, do we make equally bad choices as a society?
The list of reasons why we, as a society, sometimes make choices that are not best for us is as diverse as the list of reasons why we sometimes make bad marriages. If I gave you a one-sentence, one-word explanation for why some people make bad marriages, you would know that I was an idiot headed for divorce. And similarly with the choices by society. But some of the reasons why groups of people or societies make bad choices include conflicts of interest. What's good for the tuna fishermen on the open ocean in the short run is not good for the fish stocks and hence for society as a whole. Then one can talk about a sequence of steps at which a society can fail in making a decision. The society may fail to anticipate a problem, especially if it's a novel problem like global warming, for which we had no basis of expectation 30 years ago. Once the problem arrives, one may not perceive the problem. Global warming was hard to detect in the early phases. And then once the problem is perceived, then society may choose not to deal with the problem, as is the case with lots of elements of our society dealing with global warming today.
Does everyone need to feel some consequence of the choice that is going to be made? Because obviously if we think there are no consequences, we're not going to put as much thought or concern about what the choice is. So taking the example of the elites, Jared, if they don't suffer a consequence for the decisions, say a country, if they don't play by the same rules, then are the choices not necessarily the best for a country as a whole if the elites are not subject to the consequences?
That, Boyd, seems to me, looking at history, one of the major distinctions between societies that make bad decisions and collapse as a result, such as the classic Lowland Maya, and societies that make good decisions and carry on. That's to say, the role of the elite in the society. If the elite do not suffer the consequences of bad decisions, but if they carry on well themselves in the short run, then they're likely to make decisions that are good for themselves but ultimately bad for the society. Classic example, the collapse of the classic Lowland Maya. Why didn't the kings just look out the windows of their palaces and see the forest coming down on the hillsides and the soil erosion? Well, the kings were doing well, they were being nourished, their palaces were going up, they had insulated themselves from the short-term consequences of their actions. Whereas the opposite extreme is the Netherlands, which has an excellent water management policy, precisely because in the Netherlands 1/3 of the country is below sea level, and the politicians and the wealthy people are not living on those thin strips on top of the dikes, but they're living down below in the polders like everybody else, so that they know that if there's a failure of water management, as happened February 1, 1953, when there was a storm in the North Sea, they're going to drown along with everybody else. And knowing that you will suffer the consequences of your bad decisions is a powerful incentive to the politicians to make good decisions.
You've written about an example of how we make decisions on whether to switch lanes in traffic. We're looking at the cars going by in the other lane and we see somebody passing us, we should be over there, so we switch. but there have been tests run with cameras and actually marking the cars that show we always think the grass is greener on the other side or the cars are faster in the other lane, and it's not necessarily so. How do our eyes deceive us?
Well, there are a variety of psychological and physiological explanations for why we might have this misperception that it's faster in the next lane. But part of it is the way we integrate experience. Essentially what's happening is that when you're going slow and are being passed, you see that more of the time than when you're going fast and passing someone else, even though the number of cars that pass you or you pass is the same in both cases. It's clear, and you can scientifically prove it's a fallacy that the other lane moves faster, although I can report to you on my trip to the airport in San Francisco, every lane was going faster than my lane.
Stay in your lane. This is the rule. How do we ignore what we are seeing? Jared, you've written about Easter Island. The people had to be seeing they were cutting down every single tree on the island. What were they thinking as they cut down the last one? None had grown from the previous ones. Did they suddenly think, well, next week they'll start growing? How does a society make that decision?
People may ignore what they're seeing if they have strong reason not to want to believe it. So, for example, in the case of Easter Island, that isolated Pacific island famous for having destroyed itself by chopping down all the trees, I've wondered, so what did the person who chopped down the last tree on Easter Island think as he or she was chopping down that last tree? I don't know, but I teach elementary geography at UCLA, and I ask my students, what do you think the person who chopped down the last tree on Easter Island was saying as he chopped down the last tree? And one student said, well, probably the person thought, there are plenty of trees over in the next valley. I'm sick and tired of all these fear mongers who say that we are on the edge of disaster when there are really trees waiting for us. Another person would say, well, somebody's going to chop down this tree anyway. This tree is doomed. I have children to feed, and I might as well be the one to chop it down. And still another person, according to my UCLA students, was probably a political conservative who shouted out, I'm sick and tired of big government interfering in my right to do what I want with my private property.
Well, how are we going to deal with an issue like climate change? Part of this is instant needs versus long-term solutions. Is that some of our difficulty? We're the instant gratification society. I need what I need now, and I can't think about 20 years down the road what it might look like. Is that?
Well, there is certainly a bias in individual decision making, which is called presence bias, which says that when I consider getting something right now versus waiting a week, I really want it now. Or if you gave me the same week interval a year out, I would say, no, I would prefer to get the little extra by waiting. But people have this bias, and that certainly does distort how people make decisions. In particular, it distorts how people think about the payoff to well out into the future. Particularly, if there's any ambiguity about what those payoffs are going to be, because another feature of decision making is that if something is ambiguous, we tend to want to stay away from it. So those things all tend to bias us towards the present. It's actually related to how things are processed in the brain. The present is processed at a different place, a more emotional place than the future.
So when you're aware of how some of these choices are made, have you come up with ideas of how you can change the way we make our decisions, or new stimuli that can be put in? Because some societies make the right choices, some individuals make the right choices.
I can give you a personal example there, which comes from my work as a National Geographic explorer in New Guinea. I've learned a lot from working with New Guineans, and one of the two events that was most dramatic for me. At the time, it was not a dramatic event, but it's affected my life ever since then, watching New Guineans make decisions. We were camped out in a forest in New Guinea. I picked a campsite where I was studying birds with National Geographic support. And I picked a glorious campsite looking out over a ravine where I could see hawks and swifts underneath a magnificent tall tree. And to my surprise, the New Guineans with me said, "We're not going to sleep under that tree." "What's the matter?" "That tree is dead. It may fall down." And I said, "That's ridiculous. It's a huge tree. Yes, it is dead, but it's been standing there for 30 years. It's not going to fall over for another 50 years. But those New Guineans were so convinced that they would not sleep under that tree, and they slept 100 feet away. And I thought they were being silly, on the verge of paranoid. And then as I continued working in New Guinea, sleeping out in the forest, I realized just about every night in New Guinea that I'm sleeping in the forest, I hear one or two trees fall over per night. And then I started to do the numbers. If you're going to spend your life in New Guinea forest, 365 days a year, 10,000 days in 30 years, if the risk of that dead tree falling on you when you sleep under it is 1 in 10,000, and you're living your life in the forest, you're going to die in 30 years rather than 60 years. That's one of the things about working in New Guinea that's most influenced me, to be aware of rare risks of things that you're going to do repeatedly.
All right, don't change lanes, don't sleep under dead trees. We've got two rules here. Sometimes people make choices. In fact, there's a famous study of the Ultimatum Game about how societies make choices in trust, what to trust, how to make their decisions, and how to share. Am I going to make a choice to share something with this person? Explain the game and how it works and what it teaches us about choices we make.
Sure. The way the Ultimatum Game is played, it's two players who do not communicate with each other except through the experimenter. The experimenter gives the first player a pie and says, make a division of that pie and offer one of the pieces to the second player. If the second player accepts it, you both get your shares. If the second person rejects it, then you don't get it. The pie goes back to the experimenter. So that's the experiment.
And they all know the rules before they start.
They all know the rules. They cannot converse with each other to make a conspiracy ahead of time. So what should happen if people are purely self-interested is that the second player, if he gets any positive amount of pie, he's better off than having none. He should accept it. Therefore, the first player can offer the smallest positive amount of pie, and that'll get accepted, and so the self-interest of the first player is maximized in that way. That is not how people play. It's not how college students play, and in the play of this game in primitive societies, it's not the way people in primitive societies play either. The modal offer is 50-50, and among college students, it's usually between 30 and 40% of the pie is offered to the second player, and the offers are often rejected by about 20% of the time if it's less than substantially less than 50%.
So that's not in the best interest of the person, no matter how small a piece of pie, because he knows he's not going to get any if he says no.
He knows that he's not going to get any, but what's going on is that we have a cultural norm. I would say it's stronger than a cultural norm because it spans cultures, which is we will punish someone if they deviate from a norm, even if we ourselves are hurt by that punishment. And that seems to be a very common trait among humans.
Sometimes we're fully aware we're making a decision that's not going to be good for us, but we think it's also not going to be good for someone else, and we'd rather have that outcome.
That's right, and that presumably is a result of the way we have evolved and what kinds of group and social network interactions have survival value.
Jared, you've seen something even more amazing, is that when the person is offered a larger share than 50% of the pie, they turn it down.
It's interesting, Boyd, that this varies among societies. What Daniel has described applies to what one can call industrialized societies. And when these experiments started to be done that Daniel described, the goal was to find cross-cultural comparisons. So the experiments were done at UCLA first, and at various other American colleges, and then for cultural diversity. They were done in Buenos Aires, and they were done in Israel, and they were done in Japan. The results were all very similar, as Daniel described, but then it became realized that all of these societies were first world industrial societies with state governments. So an anthropologist at UCLA, Joe Henrich, who was working with the Machigenga Indians in Peru, got the idea of trying the experiment on the Machigenga Indians, and the results were entirely different. Among the Machigengas, a Machigenga would offer 5%, which is absurd, and another Machigenga would accept 5%. So the Machigengas, they have a different culture. They live in small family units where they're not used to dealing with other people and being fair with them. But the society that you mentioned, Boyd, where people reject high offers, is that in the northern lowlands of New Guinea, there are two societies which are called potlatching societies. These are societies in which people give gifts, and the purpose of the gift is to give a gift and gain status by giving a big gift, shaming the other person who acquires an obligation to reciprocate with an even bigger gift. And the result is that people give as big gifts as possible, but the receiver wants to refuse the gift because it incurs an obligation. Now, even though what Daniel has described is a game, and these people know perfectly that it's a game, nevertheless, they can't free themselves from how they normally operate. And among these potlatching societies, someone offered a pie, offers the other anonymous person 80% of the pie, and the person offered 80% of the pie rejects it in indignation, because that's how that society operates.
Now, one of the features of this and similar games is that they involve the element of trust between people, the trust of perhaps of someone you know, or perhaps even of someone you don't know, and trust itself seems to is an element in economic activity and trading, which seems to have very primitive roots in the development of human society. There's some very interesting experiments done by Ernst Fehr at the University of Zurich, in which people are either administered a peptide called oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is the peptide that facilitates a close approach of animals. It's related to the bond between mothers and children. It's related to the bond between sexual partners. And when this peptide is administered to students at the University of Zurich, and then they play an economic game, it turns out that this very substantially affects the degree of trust they have in the person with whom they are playing. And what it suggests is that trust was an element very early in the development of trade in humans. The brain used the same biochemistry, the same circuitry for trading and trust between trading partners that it uses between sexual partners. So the shopping and sex are really the same thing.
When the change is coming rapidly, we feel a little bit out of control, not certain what choice to make. Is there a tendency to revert to this is the way we used to do it. Let's just go back to what's familiar when we make our choices. Let's do it the way we always did it in the past, and it worked out then, even though the circumstances may be entirely different now, and the consequences different.
What reminds me of my wife is a clinical psychologist who did her training, postdoctoral training with people who are in a moment of crisis. That's to say someone who's lost a relationship, lost a relative, been fired, and so you're in a moment of crisis. In a moment of crisis, you feel that your life is not working, your way of operating is not working, you got to find a new way. The observation is that no person can live in a state of crisis, in a state of everything up for grabs forever. And so my wife's experience and this experience of crisis therapists is that for a period of 6 weeks, you're willing to reevaluate your life, and maybe you come to a new way of coping. But if you've not come to a new way of coping within the 6 weeks, then you go back to your old way because you cannot stand to operate with no guiding principles. That's the case for individuals. In the case of societies, societies also enter crises, but there's no 6-week limit. It seems to me that the United States now is in a crisis in which we are gradually realizing that what has worked for us in the past is no longer working for us in the present, and we're struggling either to hang on to the past, some of us, or to find a new solution, but it's taking us a long time either to find a new solution or to hang on to what worked and no longer seems to be working.